Hello everyone, welcome back to Sydney and Starlet, and if you're new here, welcome, enjoy the videos. So today, me and Sydney are going to be reading Disney's Home on the Range. So let's begin. Everybody, this here is Maggie, the original Miss Happy Hefter, announced Farmer Pearl. Times were hard for Pearl's little place called Patch of Heaven, but that didn't stop the kind-hearted woman from taking in Maggie, a brash cow, need of a home. The Patch of Heaven animals weren't quite as welcoming as Pearl. A show cow? Questioned a hat-wearing cow named Mrs. Calloway. Maggie looked around. The other animals were silently staring at her. Maggie smiled at them. Now don't everybody speak at one time, she joked. Prim and proper Mrs. Calloway spoke first. Good morning, Margaret, she said. A wide-eyed cow named Grace said, Hi. Wow, you're the biggest cow I've ever seen, a piglet told Maggie. Minutes later, Sheriff Brown arrived, leaping over a fence on his horse, Buck. Whoa, dagnabbit, Buck, take it easy. This ain't no rodeo, cried the sheriff. The sheriff didn't like excitement, but Buck did. The sheriff had some bad news for Pearl. The bank's calling in everybody's debts, Sheriff Brown told Pearl. If they don't get their money in 3 days, they're gonna auction off Patch of Heaven. You know, Pearl, it don't have to be this way. All you gotta do is just sell off a few of these critters, he suggested. But Pearl was furious at the idea. Stop right there, Sam. They're family. You don't sell family, she bellowed. And with that, Pearl chased Sheriff Brown off her farm. It's still my property. Now get! I said get! Pearl was heartbroken as she thought about losing her farm. I'm just plumb out of ideas, she told the cows, walking sadly into her house. Maggie had an idea. I say we go into town, butter up that sheriff's horse, and get him to give us more time, she declared, picking up the bank notice. Grace eagerly went along. Mrs. Calloway eventually followed. Back in town, Sheriff Brown received a message that Rico, the famous bounty hunter, was coming to collect a reward and get his next job. Buck was excited. His dream was to be a hero. Boy, wouldn't that be the life? Buck asked the sheriff's old dog named Rusty. Riding with Rico, cleaning up the West. When Maggie, Mrs. Calloway, and Grace reached town, Grace slapped the bank notice onto a barrel in front of Buck. Give us 3 more weeks, Maggie said. We'll have at least $60. Your farm is history, Buck interrupted. Rusty told the cows that they would need $750 to save their farm. Where are we going to get that much money? Grace asked. Just then, Rico galloped into town, ready for his next job. He learned that the only outlaw left to catch was Alameda Slim, the cattle rustler. What's the bounty? Rico asked in a low voice. $750, answered the sheriff. This gave Maggie an idea, which she told the others. If the cows caught Alameda Slim, they could collect the reward and save Pearl's farm. That's a sensible idea, mocked Mrs. Calloway. I'm gonna need a fresh horse, Rico told the sheriff. Buck saw this as his big chance to impress Rico. He raced around, did push-ups, and even tiptoed on the roof. Rico pointed at Buck. He'll do. Then the bounty hunter saddled up Buck and slipped the poster of Alameda Slim into the saddlebag. Rico's saddle. I'm wearing Rico's saddle, Buck shouted out proudly. Meanwhile, Maggie spotted a chuck wagon. She suggested to the others that they follow the wagon to a cattle drive. She reckoned that where the cattle rustlers were likely to strike next. Mrs. Calloway refused to go on such a ridiculous trip. She and Maggie started fighting, and Grace was caught in the middle. The dispute caught the sheriff's attention. He thought the 3 cows belonged to the owner of the wagon, so he tied them to the back of it. Soon the wagon rolled out of town. Buck and Rico headed off in the other direction. After a while, the wagon and the cows passed a ranch that was being auctioned off. What's going to happen to the cow who lived there? Grace wondered. Maggie replied, "She'll be okay." "How do you know?" asked Grace. "You're looking at her," Maggie answered. Maggie explains that she used to have a family like the one at Patch of Heaven, until Alameda Slim stole all the cattle and left the rancher penniless. Night fell as the wagon neared a campfire. Cowboys sat around a blazing fire while thousands of cattle slept all around them. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out through the darkness. Before anyone knew what was happening, some cattle rustlers, known as the Willie Brothers, stormed the campsite. They knocked out all the cowboys and tied them up. Moments later, Alameda Slim thundered in riding his huge buffalo named Junior. "Come on, girls," shouted Maggie. "Time to lose these ropes." Maggie and Mrs. Calloway freed themselves, but Grace became even more tangled. Then Maggie charged at Slim. Surprisingly, Slim whipped out his guitar and started to yodel. Maggie and Mrs. Calloway were spellbound by Slim's yodeling. Only tone-deaf Grace wasn't affected by the sound. "Maggie, Mrs. Calloway, snap out of it!" Grace pleaded. Grace tried to save them, but she was still tied to the wagon. When the wagon started rolling downhill, it bumped into Grace and tossed her onto the roof. Next, the wagon scooped up Maggie and Mrs. Calloway. Then Rico and Buck arrived on the scene, only to be sent flying by the out-of-control wagon. Meanwhile, Slim and the Willies escaped with the herd of cattle. On their own again, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway were more determined than ever to catch Slim and the wrestlers. They followed the tracks of the stolen cattle. "Who better to catch a cattle thief than a cow?" reasoned Grace. Slim and the Willies were hiding in the deserted mine where they had taken the stolen cattle. Slim was bragging about how he had put most of the local farmers out of business. Then Slim ducked behind a screen and came back out in different clothes. "This here is the disguise I used to sneak into all them auctions and buy all that land," he said to the Willies with a grin. He told them how he even used a different name, Wyodle. Slim looked at the map of the area and spotted a little farm he hadn't noticed before. "It's called Patch of Heaven, Uncle Slim," said Phil Willie. "It goes on auction Thursday morning." Slim immediately made plans to go to the auction disguised as Wyodle. "Every last arc counts," he sneered as he branded the section of the map marked Patch of Heaven. Back at Patch of Heaven, things looked grim as the farm and animals were about to be auctioned. Pearl worried about her cows. "I don't know what's worse, losing my farm to the highest bidder, or knowing that my girls are lost and alone out there," she fretted. Out in the range, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway had met Lucky Jack, a friendly, peg-legged rabbit. They learned that Lucky Jack had a problem. "Until recently, I too had a home. Echo mine, he told them sadly. "Some land-grabbing bandit moved in and flushed us out." Jack spotted a wanted poster of Slim and pointed at it. "This is the low-down outlaw who robbed me of my beloved Echo mine," he cried. "Echo mine," he cried. "You mean this no-good varmint is hiding out in Echo mine right now?" Maggie asked. "Without a doubt," responded Jack. They all agreed to go after Slim together. "Bovine bounty hunters? No, I've seen everything. Let's get moving, ladies," Jack suggested. When the group got to the mine, they were surprised to see Buck already there. Slim's buffalo, Junior, was refusing to let the horse in. "Cows only," Junior growled. "We got separated from the herd," Grace told Junior. So he let the cows and Jack entered. Once inside Slim's hideout, Maggie suggested a plan. "You two get his attention while I'll sneak up behind him. said Maggie to the others. I'll knock him into the cart, and then we rope him up and wheel him to justice. The cows and Jack found Slim counting money. Slim had sold the stolen cattle to Mr. Weasley, a seedy sitter slicker. It was time for action. Mrs. Calloway and Grace tossed the criminal high into the air. Maggie caught him in a minecart, and then Lucky Jack quickly tied up Slim with a rope. "Let's get out of here," shouted Grace. The cows raced to escape with Lucky standing guard over Slim in the cart. The Willies raced to their uncle's rescue. Then Junior, Buck, and even Rico joined the crazy chase through the tunnels. The whole gang spilled out of the mine, crashing into Weasley's train, its cars loaded with the stolen cattle. Slim broke free of the cart and captured the cows with a lasso. When Rico arrived at the scene, Buck overheard Slim introduce Rico to Weasley. "Let me present the most treacherous, double-crossing gun-for-hire that I have ever had the pleasure to call partner," Slim boasted, handing Rico a pile of cash. "You're too kind, boss," Rico replied. "No, it can't be," Buck whispered to himself. He had thought Rico was a hero, but Rico was in cahoots with Slim. Slim put on his disguise and rode off, saying, "Now, if you'll all pardon me, there's a little patch of heaven on the auction block this morning." "He's going to buy our farm," Grace whispered, as Weasley and the Willies herded the 3 dairy cows onto the train. Rico prepared to ride away on Buck, but the horse was furious with Rico. So Buck decided to give Rico the ride of his life. Buck galloped toward the train, bucking wildly. Rico could barely hold on. Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway watched through the slats of their boxcar. "Make a break for it, ladies," Buck called out to them. "Run!" "Buck, have you gone crazy?" Maggie hollered. "Maybe I just figured out who the real heroes are," Buck yelled back. Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway smashed against the doors, but the strong lock holding them wouldn't budge. "This is useless," Mrs. Calloway said firmly. "Let's put our heads together. More brains, less brawn." "All right," said Maggie. She took Mrs. Calloway's prized hat off her head and tossed it outside. Enraged, Mrs. Calloway charged the locked door, smashing it to pieces. The cows crashed out of the train. Buck knocked out the Willy brothers with a couple of karate kicks. Then, together, the 3 cows ganged up on Rico. "Bravo! You stopped Rico cold!" Buck applauded the cows. But Pearl's farm was about to be auctioned. "Unless we sprout wings, we'll never make it back in time," moaned Grace. Mrs. Calloway was not able to give up. "This train goes right by Patch of Heaven," she exclaimed. "We caught Slim once, and we shall do it again. Who's with me?" Quickly, Buck freed the cattle from the train. "Free! We're free!" the cattle shouted joyfully as they stampeded into the prairie. Then Buck released the cattle cars from the engine. Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway started the engine moving. Buck and Lucky Jack jumped on board. They had no time to lose. The engine raced down the tracks. Suddenly, the cows, Buck, and Jack saw another train heading straight at them. Just then, Jack spotted a track switch. "Way ahead of you. Hop on," bellowed Buck. And the 2 jumped to the ground. Buck and Jack used Jack's peg leg to flip the switch. The cows' engine moved safely to another track. "See ya back at the farm, girls. Good luck," Buck called as the engine sped away. At Patch of Heaven, the auction was coming to an end. The sheriff banged his gavel loudly. "Sold," he proclaimed. Pearl's farm had been bought by Alameda's Slim disguised as Wyodle. "Odle's the name, foreclosure's the game," he snickered to the sheriff. Pearl watched this with a heavy heart. She'd just lost her beloved farm and all her animals. At that moment, the train engine carrying the cows sped towards the auction. "Run for your lives!" yelled the sheriff. Seconds later, Maggie, Grace, and Mrs. Calloway stood facing Slim. Slim couldn't believe his eyes. It can't be," he stuttered. Grace and Maggie kicked Slim high into the air and into the train's smokestack. Mrs. Calloway turned up the engine steam to full blast, and it blew the disguise right off Slim. "It's Alameda Slim!" the surprised sheriff shouted. "Alameda Slim, you're under arrest," the sheriff declared as he lassoed the wrestler. Since Pearl's cows had caught Slim, the sheriff gave Pearl the reward money. "Woo-wee! My farm is saved!" Pearl hooted. Grace and Mrs. Calloway agreed that the farm was saved thanks to Maggie's brash ways. Smiling at her new friends, Maggie said, "You know, maybe I could hang around a while." "How about forever?" Grace suggested. Maggie couldn't think of anything she would like more. The end. So that is it for today, everyone. Really hope you all enjoyed it. And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Pick out your favorite page. Who's your favorite character?
Gatwick.
Calloway?
Gatwick.
Calloway. All right. Bye-bye.
Gatwick.